This is week 3, unit 4, Roman religion, and we'll look at some aspects of early Christianity. These are the catacombs. They are burial areas that exist outside the walls of ancient Rome. They're still there to this day. There's over 60 known areas of catacombs in Rome, and they were used as burial sites for early Christians in Rome. Now, the Christian religion obviously began in Judea and among the Jewish people, and then spread rapidly through the Eastern Mediterranean. Eventually, within the lifetime of St. Paul and St. Peter, came to Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire, the most important political place in the world at that time. Christianity began as very much a minority religion, as almost a sect of Judaism, but soon spread and was attractive to many people in Roman society, partly because it said that you didn't matter if you were a slave or a free person, that everyone could find salvation in the afterlife through Christ, no matter how bad their life was at the time. And the religion spread. It encountered a certain amount of hostility from the Roman authorities, primarily because Christians refused to worship the emperor, and Jews also got in trouble for this. Almost all the other religions besides Christianity and Judaism in the Roman Empire were polytheistic religions. And so if the Romans asked you, as they did, to worship the emperor as well as all the other gods you were worshiping, most people sort of shrugged and said, okay, we need to worship the emperor. That's what they want us to do, and we'll get on with it. But Jews and Christians believed there was only one God, and that God was not the Roman emperor, and that got them into a certain amount of trouble. Sometimes the persecution was intense, sometimes it was low level, but until the conversion of the Emperor Constantine to Christianity, Christianity was a minority religion which was persecuted to a certain extent. So the catacombs were the common burial areas for the city of Rome. Under Roman law, no one could be buried within the city, and this is just common sense because decaying bodies in a crowded city like Rome would be a recipe for disease. And now the traditional means of disposal of the dead in Rome was cremation, but Christians didn't like cremation because they believed that at Christ's second coming, their bodies would be resurrected, and that would obviously be trickier if you were burnt to ashes. So Christians, especially early Christians, wanted to have their bodies buried, and because land was scarce, the areas outside Rome began dug up for these catacombs. Now, this is a standard, what you can see here is a sort of standard passageway in any one of the catacombs, and there would be dozens of these passageways, and there would be some above and some below. They're about as wide as you can see here, not very wide enough for maybe one or perhaps two people to walk. And all of these little ledges that you see are places where bodies were originally buried. There's very few bodies still buried there now for one reason or another. These were easy to dig because the soil outside of Rome is volcanic, and it's called tufa. And tufa, basically, when you first uncover it, can be dug like clay, but as it's exposed to air, it hardens over the next few hours. So you could dig this out pretty much with a shovel, and then after a day or two, it would be hard as rock. And you would be able to dig underneath as well and have many layers of this because the rock would be hard enough to support a roof above and a ceiling above and a floor below. And so it's very easy environment for tunneling. And so that's how these catacombs came to be. And all sorts of people were buried in them, not just Christians, but because Christians insisted on bodily burial rather than cremation, they were popular, the catacombs, as a way of Christians to dispose of their dead as a burial place. Here is the so-called Crypt of the Popes in the Catacomb of San Callisto, south of Rome, off the Appian Way. And this was one of the more prestigious places to be buried. Several early popes were buried here, as well as martyrs were buried here. Because it was the early days of the church, a lot of the people buried in the catacombs were people who were very important in subsequent Christian history. They were saints. St. Peter and St. Paul were thought to be buried here, as well as St. Luke and any number of other people. Whether they actually were is a bit unclear at this point, but the idea was that the catacombs were places where martyrs were buried and where Christian heroes were buried and saints and popes. And so even though it was a sort of common burial place and not at all fancy in a lot of ways, it was a great honor to be buried in the catacombs along with the sort of dignitaries of the church. And here you can see the Crypt of the Popes is a little more ornate and elaborate than the regular catacombs, though it's still pretty bare bones as far as sort of glory goes. You can see there's some brickwork there, as well as the tufa and a column. 3rd century Crypt of the Popes is what the sign says. Now, one of the fundamental sort of significances of the catacombs is not just as a sort of burial site, but for the record they give of early Christian art, because before the conversion of Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, Christianity didn't have that much of an authorized existence, so churches and so on were very sort of rudimentary structures, and often worship occurred in people's homes. That meant if you wanted to decorate somewhere with explicitly Christian art, one of the best places to do that would be in the funerary areas like the catacombs. And here we see some very, very early examples of themes that would be common throughout Christian art. This is a theme of the so-called agape feast. It shows a group of Christians eating together. This is an early version of communion or a mass, the Eucharist, the Last Supper, the symbolic eating of Christ's body and blood. And we see this very early 3rd century painting from the wall of the catacombs. There are other examples. Here is fish and a loaf of bread, recalling the miracle in the Gospels where Christ feeds a multitude of people with just a few fish and bread, which he miraculously multiplies to feed everybody, thus symbolizing that Christ's power can come to everyone, even though it may seem small and it may seem humble, but it can reach everyone. And this is painted on the walls, again, in the catacombs. Here's another example of a biblical illustration. These are Christians in the fiery furnace, recalling the vision from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, where Daniel sees 3 people who are placed into a furnace of fire and they do not burn. And the idea that your faith will get you through the horrors of the afterlife and bring you safely to heaven is dramatized here in this wonderful painting of 3 people standing amid the fires. And finally, here is one of the most famous painted images from the catacombs, the image of the Christian figure of the Good Shepherd, the idea that Jesus is like a shepherd taking care of sheep, taking care of his congregation the way that a shepherd takes care of sheep. And this goes back to the psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, but is also brought out at various points in the gospel. And here you can see a very early visual image of this from the catacombs again. So the catacombs provide a sort of repository and a treasure house of early Christian art.